Hi, I'm Josh from UV Filter Monocles, and today we're going to be teaching you aperture, shutter speed and ISO. So in photography, light is measured in what's called stops. Now stops are a bit like degrees or watts. Each stop of light is either half or double the amount of light. So cameras control how much light gets into them through three variables: aperture, shutter speed and ISO. So we're going to start with aperture because it's probably the hardest to understand. An aperture is a variable hole inside your lens which opens and closes to let in more or less light. Aperture is measured in f-stops, which is the fraction of the focal length of the lens. On this 135mm lens, this is an aperture of 2.8, which is a 2.8th of the lens, and we can move that down to a 22nd of the lens's focal length. The main thing to remember is that a smaller number will mean a bigger aperture, which will let in more light. Aperture also affects depth of field. So if we look at this as a subject here and light's reflecting off of it, these skewers have become the light reflecting towards the sensor, which we'll have here. So when we focus the lens, or if you've got an autofocus lens it'll do it for you, these light rays converge and we can move this point, which is where the subject's in focus, further or closer to the sensor. And everything here and here will be out of focus. As we then stop down our lens, these come closer together. If I can manage to do that. Yep. And the amount that is and isn't in focus is a lot smaller. And so this means that everything in your frame behind and in front of this point of focus will be at least a lot more in focus when it's stopped down. So this is a shot of me shot at a very large aperture of 1.8, and this is a shot of me at f8. Notice the things behind me are a lot more in focus now. Alright, secondly we have shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time your camera's shutter opens to let in light, and it's a little bit like a sponge and it absorbs light. The upside to longer shutter speeds is that they let in more light. The downside, however, is they could be prone to blur, such as motion blur, or if you're holding the camera unsteadily, it can result in the entire frame being a little bit blurred. Finally we have ISO. ISO is the speed that your camera's sensor or piece of film reacts to light. So back in the days of film, each piece of film would have a rating. This is 400, and inside this camera we have a 100 speed film. What that means is that this piece of film can pick up 4 times as much light as the other camera in the same amount of time, and thus it's 2 stops brighter. The disadvantage to having faster film, such as 400, digital cameras can actually change on the fly, so you don't need to buy different films, you just up it how sensitive your sensor is. The disadvantage to higher ISOs is that they introduce more grain and digital noise. Finally we have our 3 shooting modes. In manual, both the aperture and shutter, and on a digital sensor ISO, are up to you. On aperture priority, you pick the ISO for digital and the aperture for both, and the camera picks a shutter speed for you which correlates to the correct exposure. TV mode, which is S on Nikon, you pick the shutter speed and the camera picks the aperture.